Welcome to this episode in my podcast series around vertical development. In today's episode, I'm going to draw a parallel between the sports world on one side and the business world on the other side. So I'm going to make an analogy between division football and leadership development. So, first I would like you to go back in time and imagine a period of time where there were no social medias, where sports were only covered maybe in a newspaper once in a while. There weren't a lot of TV, there weren't a lot of coverage in general of different type of news. At this point in time, we're going to follow Mike, our main character, who lives in a small city in a rural area. He plays football with his teammates every Sunday. And they play against the other neighboring cities. So it's very, very low basic, it's amateur level. Everyone enjoys it and they go every Sunday and they play. One day a spectator, a traveler who was traveling through their city, who had seen them play, comes up to the team after and say, "Hey guys, how come you're not playing in division football?" Some of them had heard about this division football, but not something they had really looked further into. But they get intrigued and soon they contact the football association and they come out and evaluate them, and they are included in the division football and are placed in the third division. Very impressive coming from an amateur level. So soon they begin to play in the third division, and now it's a very different experience. Where the team was used to winning every Sunday, they now mostly lose every Sunday. The teams they're playing against have a very, very different set of capacities. And it hugely impacts the team because suddenly some team members are realizing that they are not so good as they thought they were. Some are up for the challenge. They have a coach. The coach is really doing his utmost to help the team players grow in their football skills. However, he's part-time, he's also an amateur, so it's limited how much he can really do. Some of the players are not that motivated. They probably more went to football because it was fun. Now the expectations is high, they're coming home feeling they're not good enough and so on. So over that period of time, some players will leave the team and others will join. Other players who are more committed and more interested in having football at this level. Nonetheless, the team actually managed to play themselves up in the division and ends among the best and gets promoted up to the second division. The following season, they start in the second division, and again, they're probably among the poorest performing, but the bar has been lifted, and they play against other teams who in many areas have better capacities than they have. Some of the team players in Mike's team are not up for the challenge. So gradually there is a shift of a lot of players. Some new are arriving, and some of the new one who arrives are very, very good at football compared to the existing team members. So they become solid role models for Mike and his teammates and helps them grow as football players. Because suddenly they play among other people who have skills that they have never seen before, and they get inspired and help to learn it themselves. Mike is very committed. He's really beginning to feel how football is what he really burns for. So as he grows in football, he realizes how much he likes it. So he's seeking a lot of feedback, both from his coach, but also from his team players. One of the things that his coach is pointing out is that Mike has to become a better team player. He has to stop focusing so much on his own talent and what he can deliver, and how he, combined with the other team players, are going to deliver these outstanding results. He also begins to focus much more on reading all the subtle signals that his co-players are playing, so he begins to understand another level of the game that he hasn't been aware of before. A few years goes by and Mike continues to work with himself and is beginning to pay off. So one day he gets a call from a football talent scout who is offering him a contract in a first division club. Mike is thrilled. He's really feeling his career is taking off now, and he accepts right away. Mike is now playing in the first division, and history repeats itself. So where he was before among the best in his second division, he's again among the poorest performing now when he is in a higher division. Mike realizes that his career has developed very fast. Maybe his skill set hasn't really developed to the level needed to perform here. So he again speaks with his coach around his development areas. Now he has a coach which is very different from the previous coaches he has had, because this coach has a very different skill set. So he points out other areas that he needs to work on, and together with his teammates, who also acts as very strong role models, all of them playing better than him right now, helps him develop as a football player. Mike takes all the input on board because he's very driven and he really wants his career to take off, and visible progress is beginning to show. He's now beginning to get much more strategic. His focus on his opponents, understanding not his co-players, because he's become very good at that, but understanding the opponents, what strategies do they typically play, who is he playing up against, what should he do to overcome that challenge, and so forth. So he's beginning to see football even wider than he did in the past. He also reflects a lot on his performance. So helped by his coach and his team players, he gets a lot of feedback, but that begins to make him reflect a lot himself around what did he do well, what didn't he do so well. He even begins to talk openly around his own development areas. So for instance, when he's being interviewed after a match, he may be sharing that he didn't do well here. He knows he has a development area, but he's very focused on it, and he already see how he's progressing. So he gets much more affirming towards himself and his development needs. So he don't beat himself up when he's not good, which he did when he was younger, and also did towards others when he was younger. Now he begins to see himself as a person who identifies areas of improvement, and by focusing on those, he overcomes them and begins to see new areas of improvement. At one point, Mike speaks with his coach, and he's sharing that he really has this aspiration and ambition to play in the Champions League. To his surprise, his coach is very supportive. The coach explains that because Mike is so driven and taking on board development areas, he could actually see him reach the very, very high level. He points out some areas which he should focus on, and one of them is his mental state. Because despite Mike is developing a lot of skills and becoming much better at doing different tasks at the field, his mental state at times destroys it all for him. He has a tendency to be carried away with his emotion, become very outward reacting, and then he loses focus. So he begins to get a mental coach. This mental coach helps him focus, get all the noise out of his system. So he may have had a bad day at home before he went for the match, or spectators may be doing a lot of noise, or an opponent is provoking him. But he begins to be able to control himself, so he's focusing on what he's there to do, play the game, and be focused on delivering the results that he's paid well for. A few years later, guess what? That call comes. Mike gets offered a contract with a Champions League club, and he accepts right away. So this was an example of a career progression in football. It could have been handball, volleyball, basketball, American football, tennis, badminton. Doesn't really matter what sport it is. It's around the concept that as an athlete, you need to develop certain skills, and on those skills you develop more, and you develop more, and gradually you become more professional and become among the best. So why is it interesting to draw a parallel between the sports world and the business world? Well, if you look at the sports world, in today's world where we have all the social media, you have all the TV channels, all the sports coverage and so on, you will have a lot of coverage around athletes and how well they're doing. So you will have typically what you could call Monday coaches sitting in the studio evaluating a performance. That may be former athletes have been very professional in their lives in the past, but now due to age, they've become people who help us understand who is doing well and who is not doing well. They will evaluate based on their huge knowledge within a given sport, why a given player is doing well and why they're not doing well, what they should develop, where their weaknesses are, who is up for promotion, who is up for relegation, and so forth. So we get a lot of transparency, and even if we don't play the sports ourselves, we can begin to understand what makes a good player in a given sport. Basically, we can sit comfy in our sofa at home and become experts ourselves. So then look at the business world. It's the opposite. There is limited to non-transparency in leadership. Who is good, who is bad, we don't really know. We can have an idea. We may be able to observe them from a distance, see small areas of their leadership, how they're performing in given situations, but we never really get the full picture. And if you draw the parallel to the horizontal and the vertical development in the previous podcast, when you horizontally develop, very often you get marks. So if you want to be a nurse or doctor or a finance person or marketing person, or doesn't really matter which education, most educations will give you marks. Are you getting an A or B minus, or what are you getting? So you get an idea where you're performing in a given horizontal skill set. On the vertical one, very rarely. There is, of course, the 360 evaluations. 360, if you don't know, is the evaluation where you typically get a manager of yours, some peers, some employees, maybe your manager's manager, and maybe some external stakeholders to evaluate you based on a lot of more softer skills, which falls under vertical development. And then you can get like a fixed picture of where you're performing right now. That can give you that feeling of a mark like you would get in the horizontal. So you get an A or B or C, and you can identify certain areas of improvement. But it doesn't give you where you need to operate to be successful in different type of leader roles. It only gives you a still picture how you're performing right now. So it doesn't give you that transparency around what is expected if you are very driven and you want to move to a higher level yourself. The only thing you know when you really grow in leadership is that as you grow, you typically will be expected to deliver a different set of results in your leadership. But which capacities, skills you need to deliver those are often not clear. And some, like in the sports world, will take up the challenge. So they will develop based on the input they will get as they grow in leadership. Others will not. Some will even be oblivious to their own shortcomings. Hence, they will not realize that they do have a huge development need and will stay where they are today. They may not have a manager or boss or someone who is giving them a push to activate a development in them. You may even have managers who is operating at a given leadership role, which they're really not fit for. They may have ended in that role because they got promoted for the wrong reasons at a wrong point of time. Or they may have some good sponsors that are helping them in their career, or may only focus on a few of their skills, but not realize that a lot of the other skills that are needed to really be successful is not existing. Some of them may even be promoted to even higher position, and then it becomes even more visible for many people that they're not fit for the role, but they may still survive. Why? Because there is not the same transparency in the leadership world as you see in the sports world. In the sports world, that wouldn't happen because it would be so visible that, for instance, a football player is not really having the qualifications to play in a first division, so his or her career would stop. In leadership, not so often. Luckily, because the requirements to corporates and their performance today is increasing, you see less and less managers being in senior roles in at least very big organizations and then surviving a career if they don't develop their skills and their capacities. But in smaller corporates, which may be a little bit under the radar, you still find leaders who may not be really equipped to carry out the job they have and still continue to have it. It also has to be mentioned that not all chooses to become leaders. So some leaders may be promoted because they were the best within a given area, and because they were so good, an organization chose to promote them. They may have no aspiration to become a leader, so they begin to do leadership on the side, but not as a committed task. And that also means that how they lead reflects their interest in leadership. Other people may choose leadership due to the prestige of it, or they have surroundings putting pressure on them to become managers because they want them to. It can be their spouse, their family, their friends. All in our family has been leaders, so we expect you to be too. Leaders coming with the wrong intentions often struggle developing themselves because they don't have the right motivation to really grow. And to draw a parallel back to the sports world, like in Mike's example, there were players in the original football team who ended being promoted up to a third division, but didn't really thrive in it. But in football, they would be replaced. In leadership, not necessarily. Luckily, many leaders do work with themselves and have an interest in leadership and want to make a difference in their leadership career. And some will reach the first division or even the Champion League. What also characterizes leaders that really work with themselves is that they become much more self-aware. They become very strong in self-leadership. So they realize that they need to take ownership of their own career. They seek input, they identify areas of improvement, and they work on them. So they become very self-driven. That development is often helped by different factors like strong role models in the organization or senior managers that they have or have worked with who has inspired them to work with themselves. It may also be from peers who are very good, i.e. leaders operating equal to them, but they have some capacities that really inspire them. And for some, it will be, for instance, executive coaches that helped people develop themselves and accelerate their leadership development. And again, it resembles the sports world because you won't find top performing athletes who doesn't get a lot of support to get there. So all top athletes will have coaches, and the coaches are not better than the athletes, and they are not meant to be better than the athletes. But what the coaches do for athletes is that they help them identify and develop the areas where they should improve. So they become like a sounding board, someone they can speak with, someone who can identify areas, someone who helps them overcome some challenges and then helps them develop themselves. And the same you see in leadership, especially by very driven leaders who are very committed to develop themselves. So what makes a good leader? Well, it really depends on the scope of the role and position you're holding. Is it the stakeholder management? Is it your ability to understand complexity at work? Or maybe something third, or it could be a combination of all of it. It depends on which role you're holding, and it will change as you grow in leadership. The thing is that we often don't know it, and that's where the vertical development as a framework comes in very handy, because it kind of sets out what is expected if you want to play in the third division, second division, first division, Champions League, or even higher in leadership. What is it that you need to be able to do? What capacities, skills are required to operate at one level compared to another, compared to a third? And like in sports, each stage builds on the previous one. So you can't go from third division to first division. You can't go from the first leadership stage to the third leadership stage without going through the second one. Because you need to develop certain skills and capacities and have a strong foundation on which you can build new capacities, on which you can then build new capacities and so on. So it will always take time, like in sport, to develop, but it will also require that you become very strong in given skills before you really are able to build new skills, because they will draw on the things that you have learned to do in the previous ones. So the framework basically gives you clarity around what is required, like you have in the sports world. We all can see what is required to play in the Champions League. This framework gives you an idea of what is required to play at a very high leadership stage. And again, it doesn't necessarily equal rank, but you will struggle holding a successful senior executive position if you're operating on the very low leadership stages. So these stages both tell you what you gain by growing in leadership stages, but it also, on the flip side, helps you understand what limitations you have if you operate at a given leadership stage. Because let's assume you're operating at the second leadership stage. You can identify what the third leadership stage are capable of doing in their leadership, and hence you probably won't be able to deliver those results right now where you operate from. So how can you use it? Well, you can use it in a very tactical way. So you may have a 30-year employee, very high talented girl, let's call her Maria. She's working, she's having a team of 10, she's very strong in her skills and she is on a development journey. However, she's not very good at motivating her team. She has a tendency to be very task-oriented, which characterizes the first leadership stage. And because she's so task-oriented, she doesn't motivate their personal growth and their excitement because she constantly corrects what they're working on. By understanding this vertical development framework, you will be able to see that, for instance, to get to the next level, you have to be better at coaching your employees. You have to begin to see them in a wider context. You begin to see people more than tasks and so on. So that can help you identify that one of the development areas that Maria has to develop to be able to progress in her leadership role is to develop a very different leadership style. You can then identify areas and ways to help her improve that, so she gradually begins to move away from a certain leadership behavior towards a new one that becomes her typical leadership approach. So when we talk retention and silent quitters, one of the challenges with that is that it's very often the best talent who leaves your organization. And those are the ones you want to keep. But driven talent also likes to work with themselves. Some may need a little bit of support to understand that there are development areas, but because the framework also gives you the ability to tell a given employee what it is they will gain by developing it. So it's not just you should change your behavior and motivate your team members. No, you will, for instance, explain you should change your behavior. We need to work on you developing your ability to motivate your teams because it will give you this and it will give you that. Then you both give the reason for giving it. You also help the person understand what they will gain personally by developing it. And hence they will begin to develop at a personal stage and vertically develop. But you can also use it for yourself because it can help you understand where you're operating today. Are you operating at the first, second, third, or fourth, or fifth leadership stage? What is it that you can then deliver in your leadership right now where you operate? By then identifying the areas that you need to work on, either at a given stage or to reach the next stage, can then help you set a targeted approach for how you want to drive your career development. So back to the football world, Mike sought a lot of input to really grow as a football player. Driven talent typically also seeks support to grow. And as you begin to identify what it is you need to develop right now, then you can work on that. And as you reach a higher stage, then you can work on that if you want to grow even faster. It all comes down to your own aspiration and ambition for where you want to go. But again, to draw the parallel for the sports world, you can only progress when you get the right input to really realize where it is you should develop to be successful at a given stage or if you want to reach the next stage. And that is what the vertical development framework gives you. As a little bonus, it has to be mentioned that when you develop vertically, often in a corporate context, it also benefits you in your private life. So a lot of the capacities that vertical development describes and can help you focus on will also have an impact on your private life. So, for instance, if you become better at stakeholder management and you go through the different steps, so you eventually become very good at stakeholder management, you will also be very good in your private life managing people around you, managing family, managing friends, getting things to pan out in a much more constructive way than you may have been able to in the past. Or your ability to understand complexity at work expands, so you begin to see it in a different way and approach it in more constructive ways, not do the same every time. Suddenly you can do that in your private life as well. So one-to-one, very often as you grow vertically, it both impacts your way of leading and how you lead or act as a human being at your corporate side and in your private side. I hope you found this episode in my podcast series around vertical development interesting. I chose to make an analogy because sometimes it helps people see a given topic in a very different way. Maybe it worked for you. Maybe you believe that other people would benefit from seeing it or hearing it. So do make a recommendation. If you have a reflection over it, do write it in the commentary field below. And otherwise, I hope to see you in the next podcast, where I will describe the first leadership stage, which is called the experts. All the best. Bye-bye.